welcome from me as well. My name's Suryagupta, and here is Subhuti. So yeah, it's a real pleasure and actually an honour to be speaking with you in this format, which is we've never done anything like this before, and it feels a sort of rare occurrence, for us to have this kind of conversation in this way. So many of you will know Subhuti as a writer, a Dharma teacher. I don't know if you describe yourself as a scholar. No, okay, not a scholar. But certainly a great thinker, I would say. He's been associated with this centre since its inception. Before its inception, of course, because you were the foreman of the build. Yeah, so that's how you've been described, as the sort of leader of the build. Is that right? I'm looking at Attila and others who were there.
Don't look at Attila.
Don't look at Attila, right? Certainly, Subhuti led the building project. I've heard stories about that period. And one of the things people have said is that he really had so much faith and vision in the project that you were very persuasive, and people did on many occasions did what you said. And then one guy was telling me this week that you found out that he had skills. And you went down, I think he lived in Brighton or somewhere, and said, you have to join this project. And he came, he followed. And he said, as many of the builders have said, how transformative that period was. And you were a very big part of that. So he sort of led the building project. He was the first chair of the centre and has continued to be the president of this centre since. And that involves usually 2 annual visits a year.
Checking up on you.
Checking up on the chairs. And actually those visits are very significant. They've been very significant to this centre because on those visits, many of you know that he'll teach. He'll sort of share his rambles. In the last few years we've been doing this series of rambles, which are also happening this time round as well. Also, you work very closely with the council, the chairs, and actually meeting up with many, many people, those directly involved in the centre and often sometimes not as well. So it's really been a very good friend to many, many people over the years. So I feel we've been very fortunate at this centre to have your ongoing presence, and your loyalty to the centre, and I want to thank you for that. And in a way, as you said, it's also, in a way, what you've done for this centre, it's an example, really, of the influence you've had in Triratna generally, specifically, I think, for the order, and also in India. Your influence spreads very wide. Many of Subhuti's talks and things are online, and you can listen to those, and or you're ongoingly thinking about the Dharma and expressing it in different ways. And tonight, it's more of a sort of a personal chat, really, we're going to be having. It's very much around Subhuti, the sort of a man and your practitioner. So I'm really looking forward to that. I want to thank you for being prepared.
Ready for anything.
Yeah, prepared. So I want us to warmly welcome Subhuti. We launched the 40th, we call it 40-40 celebrations of the London Buddhist Centre. We launched it a few weeks ago now, is it 3-4 weeks ago now? And the day after we launched it, Bhante died. And for our magazine, you wrote an article for our magazine celebrating the 40th, and Bhante was interviewed. So if you haven't read those, I would really encourage you to read those. But I want to start there with Bhante. In a way, well, for all of us, I think it's still, it's very much still with that, and taking that in, the significance of that. And I guess I'm wondering how it was for you, or how you are now, really, with his death. If you want to say a few words about that.
Well, of course, it wasn't a surprise. He was a very old man, and he'd nearly died a couple of years ago. He had pneumonia then, and to the doctor's astonishment, responded to the antibiotics. And I got some prior warning. I was told by his carers that it didn't look very likely he'd survive. And definitely one got an impression that he'd been preparing. He'd seen a number of people who he hadn't seen for a long time, like somebody today, Kudaratna. He had not had much contact with Bhante for some time, and Bhante called him to see him. And it's pretty obvious that Bhante was saying goodbye to a series of people in a very unassuming and easy way. So it wasn't a shock to me. In a way, I was quite ready for it. And I suppose, in reality, as far as I'm concerned, Bhante's not dead. He's so much part of the architecture of my being, if you like, that doesn't really make much difference. In a certain way, I won't be able to meet the old chap and have one of those fascinating conversations. You never know where it's going to go, what he's going to want me to do, and what he's going to be completely uninterested in discussing. and so it's always a surprise to see Bhante. So yeah, I regret that I won't be able to do that. But as far as my own confidence in the Dhamma, my own personal life is concerned, and my own feeling about the future of our order and movement, doesn't make a lot of difference. He's just as present in my mind, in my being, as he's ever been. And I think in some ways he's more present because the inconvenience of his physical being is gone, which could be pretty inconvenient. But I sort of realise how deeply he's soaked into me. He's formed me. Whatever I am is mainly formed by him, my contact with him. And my sense is that that dimension of him is still very much alive, because it's on a level that's beyond space-time. And Bhante was rooted in that dimension. So for me, that's still very much alive. That's who Bhante really was. So yes, I can't say that, I was sort of shocked in a way that death always shocks, because it's so incomprehensible. Death is not something you can really think about, if you see what I mean. It's a just sudden stopping. But in another level, I'm completely equanimous about it. And certainly as far as the movement is concerned, I've absolutely no worries. I don't think Bhante planned it all, but he might just as well have done it. He really, everything was in place by the time he came to go. He did hand on in 2000, and I think he thought at that time that he was relieved of the responsibility, as it were. But unfortunately, we weren't really ready to take fully on what he handed on to us. And I certainly think I wasn't. I think I made a little bit of a mess of it. He obviously felt he had to sort of pull himself back in 2009 and re-establish things that had got a bit shaky. And of course also a lot of unresolved issues connected with his own past, connected with the past of the movement, had to come out. And much better they came out while he was still there. We could sort of all go through, and I went through quite a bit of confusion about my relationship to Bhante over those sort of issues. And many others even more so. But I think we've achieved in the last year or so a kind of peace with it all. I don't say that there will not be new problems and issues and so forth, but I think Bhante couldn't go because it wasn't finished. When it was finished, he went. It's as simple as that, and he planned it absolutely perfectly. There was going to be a public preceptors gathering from all over the world just 5 days after his death. I mean, what timing! And he died so peacefully, so happily, so easily. He'd spent his 5 years at Adhisthana, which meant that his Adhisthana was rooted, his blessings were rooted into the very fabric of the place. He says that the last 2 years of his life were amongst the happiest of his life. So if he'd gone earlier, we'd have been left with a certain unfinishedness. How do you plan that? But that's Bhante. He told me once that, because I'm of a temperament, I used to be of a temperament to try to plan everything in advance with my brilliant intellect. And so Bhante said, I never plan anything. I didn't plan to start a movement. It just sort of happened. And I believe him. I think he really didn't. One thing happened, so he responded. Another thing happened, so he responded. So he simply responded to the situation that he was left with, so to speak, in those last years, and he couldn't go because things were not tidy enough, it wasn't stable enough, and when the last pieces were in place, he could go. And he wanted to go. He wanted to go. He told me that quite straightforwardly, about 6 years before. He said that he really did want to rest. He wanted to go. He wanted to die. And he said he didn't want to come back, but he had taken the Bodhisattva vow, so he's on his way. And you'll recognise him by the fact that the tip of his nose, the top of his head is one straight line.
Thank you.
For that extraneous detail, yeah.
So I really, you talked about sort of your I felt very reassured by your equanimous response to his death, actually. And there was 2 images that stood in my mind. I think you heard of his death and you was in Hungary.
Yeah.
And then you must have just got a ticket straight back, and then you was at the airport.
Yeah.
And you were speaking very, you could tell you were taking the news in, but you were communicating something very important in that Facebook post. It was, and then I had 2 other images. One was of the funeral itself, where I don't know how long you spoke for at the funeral, 10 minutes,
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Exactly.
But it was it was exactly what I wanted you to say, needed you to say, even if I hadn't even conceived that in my mind. So I felt very sort of gladdened and reassured by your comments at the funeral.
Yeah.
And then the last image, I wasn't able to be at the funeral. I flew back from South Africa that day. But I participated on live stream, and it was an interesting scene because I had lots of candles and incense and various things and shrines, and then I had 2 screens, my laptop and my iPad, so I could see the different streams coming. And when one camera sort of stopped working, I sort of watched the other one, and so it's kind of like very lovely ambient atmosphere at the same time. These screens are doing all kinds of things. But at the end of the live stream, you were one of the last people I noticed circumambulating the funeral mound with Indian Dharmacharinis and Dharmacharis behind you.
Yeah.
I found that very moving, and then it all went dead. Both one screen, the other screen. But that was the last image that I saw. Yeah. And I don't know, there was something in that image. I thought that feels very significant for me, and it's partly your connection with India, and our connection with India, and therefore with the origins, of Buddhism, and but also the work you've been doing, in India, and the way you were circumambulating as well. There was there was just a lot of, it felt very, a lot of energy and a lot of devotion and reverence. That's what I saw, and I was very moved by that. I don't know if you want to say anything else about your experience at the funeral or in that transition.
I think I want to go back to when I was in Hungary. I did know that it was quite likely that Bante would die, but I decided I'd just go anyway because my gypsy friends were waiting. And so it's a bit in the back of my mind. They just drove me straight up to the school that we run in northern Hungary, Dr. Ambedkar High School. And we launched straight into, as usual, lots of discussion about the situation they're in, which is dreadful. A lot of political pressure and financial difficulties. It's really, really... And they're just carrying on. János was telling me he's feeding the students out of his own pocket. So we were talking about all that and how we could help. And then the next morning I got the news and I went and said, look, I'm really sorry. Bante's just died. And János immediately said, well, you must go back. And I said, well, I haven't made up my mind. And he said, oh, yes, you have. You're going. And so he said, you get a ticket. So I went and got a ticket. And I came back and I said, I've got a ticket at 7 o'clock at night or something like that. And he said, well, I'll drive you to the airport. It's 3 hours. So I said, no, I'll get a train. He said, no question, I will drive you. And he and Tibor, two of the Dhammamitras, just with incredible sensitivity and appreciation and sympathy. It was an extraordinary experience of empathy with people I've been sort of cultivating a friendship with from such a different background to mine, such a different experience. We've managed to reach each other, and that they could support me at that time meant so much to me. When I got back, I just sent a message saying that, I will never forget what you did. 3 hours down, 3 hours straight back. So I had to start the school the next morning. And János wrote back just saying, what a great man Bante was, that he has touched the lives of millions. He's managed to bring together the East and the West, which is very important to him as coming from a, ancestrally Indian background, although, there's no memory of it, and feeling more of an affinity with Indian Buddhism than with Western Buddhism. But through Bante and Bante's connection with the work in India, that meant a huge amount to him. So that really, really moved me. The beautiful delicacy and sensitivity and empathy, a huge amount to me. Then I was in touch with my friends in India, and we have a YouTube channel, Triratna India YouTube channel, some really good stuff on it. Neha, the Dhammamitra who runs it, said, can you do something? So I was sitting in the airport, I found a quiet corner, I turned the thing on and I thought, what am I going to say? And these things just came out of my mouth, which were, I think, completely the right thing. And I felt then very much in touch with Bante, see what I mean? So that it meant a lot to me, and it seems to have meant a lot to people in India, and certainly here too. I felt very important to say, it's all right. There's nothing to worry about. Yeah, we mourn, but no panic, no worry. Bante's done his job. Why should we mourn him if he hasn't done his job? But he has. And then, yes, you mentioned the walking round with the Indians. Vidyaruchi had been teaching at Bhaja Retreat Centre in India. And the Bhaja community were very, very devoted to Bante. None of them have met him. Well, 2 or 3 of them met him, but most have not met him. And Indians, it's amazing. They, the thousands of people involved with our movement who have a tremendous feeling for Bante, never met him. But what they say is, we know what Bante's done for us. Our lives are completely different because of Bante. We don't mind what he's done. They sent with Vidyaruchi a rock from a cave that Padmasambhava meditated in, a jade vajra, some soil from Bhaja, and some leaves from the Bodhi tree that Bante himself planted when they launched the centre there. So we were circumambulating with those and then dropped them down, careful not to bash in the top of the the coffin. And so very, very powerful, and most of the Indians were there. Yeah, and it was very important to make that connection where Bhante has so many deeply, deeply loyal disciples who really know how much their lives have been changed, just as Janosch and Kubu and Tibor know how much their lives have been touched by Bhante. So yeah, those 3 moments you picked out, well, I didn't mention giving the talk, that was, I knew it was the most testing talk of my life, you see what I mean? I had to get it right. And I didn't know properly what I was going to say until I got up. Mind you, I never know what I'm talking about. But again, I seemed to say what needed to be said, and it didn't seem as if it was me that was deciding what to say. And I felt very strongly Bhante's presence in me and with me.
Thank you. So yeah, one of the things that you sort of mentioned, Bhante preparing for his death in different kind of ways. And then one of the things when somebody dies is that we do have memories come to us, don't they, and incidents and events, and we sometimes reconfigure how we sort of, they have different significance, or we look at them differently. I was wondering if there's any, apart from what you said, is there any other sort of events incidents that you're sort of sitting with now, or sort of reflecting on, or that's just come to you in a different kind of way since he's...
I guess that it inevitably, and perhaps partly because it's also the 40th anniversary, my mind goes back to my earliest contact with Bhante, which was 48 years ago, 49 years ago, 50 years ago. I'm that old, and some. But most of you, if you've met Bhante, you've met him in the latter days when he presented as an elderly gent, if you see what I mean. But I've known many Bhantes over the course of time, all of which are underlain by this same sort of transcendent brilliance. But in the early days, he was dynamite. He was dangerous. I remember going into the centre at Monmouth Street, and believe it or not, I was a quite shy young man. It was a small shop in Monmouth Street, 14 Monmouth Street. You should pay a visit sometime. And it was a shop that didn't seem to sell anything. It was a Zen shop. It literally was. But at the back there was a sort of very narrow winding staircase with Buddha footprints on the ceiling, which I thought was weird and wild and exotic. And I went down there. Yes, I should say how I was introduced, because I saw Marichi today, who at that time I was living with, and who heard Bhante speaking on the radio. She worked for BBC World Service, and she heard Bhante interviewed. And he was asked, well, what would you do if, a hippie came? And Bhante said, well, I would invite them downstairs and teach them how to meditate. So I thought, that's the man for me. My hair was down here at that time. So, yes, I made my way down, and tiny little rooms. What have we got now? Two tiny little rooms, a little shrine room and a little reception room. And it was packed with people. It was as blocked as a cube of ice, nobody talking. And, being a very shy young man, I made my way to the notice board and started assiduously reading the notices without any awareness of what I was reading. But I became aware of this figure sort of sitting in the middle of the room. It was the sort of epicenter around which everything was sort of constellated. And he was completely at his ease, in wearing, I have to say, a somewhat grubby robe, with rings on his fingers, not bells on his toes, but with long hair and a decidedly disreputable appearance. And of course, it was wonderful for a young sort of pseudo-hippie. Absolutely wonderful. And I remember him giving me a sort of look that just took me in from top to toe to top. And a sort of amusement, as if he was laughing at me in the gentlest and kindest of ways. But he saw me, just like that. He saw me, and the image was like a lion that's had a good meal and is just sitting back, just sort of watching and enjoying the scene. No danger, no fear, nothing to bother him, and it's extraordinary. Extraordinary. And then the meditation class afterwards, I had a jhanic experience, which I haven't had for the next 50 years. So exaggerating wildly, but he led us into the mindfulness of breathing. Is so skillfully a body scan and very, very gentle, skillful leading in, and just the sort of tone of his voice. I was meditating already. And then a little bit later, might not have been that time, they all get a bit conflated, but fairly soon after that, there was a question and answer session. And again, he's sort of leaning back at his ease, and a group, mainly young people sitting around him. And I just so deft and very skillfully taking the questions and making complex things very, very clear. And I sort of thought at one point, he's not actually talking about Buddhism. He's just talking about life. He's talking about experience. And, knew his Western culture. He knew his literary references, his aesthetic, philosophical. He's just deeply, deeply impressed by the breadth of his mind. And at one point, fascinated, I was sort of staring at him, and he caught my eye. And for, probably what was, half a millisecond, we locked eyes, and, he was sort of looking back, oh yeah, come on, show me what you're worth. And, of course, I looked away. But I realised here was a man who wanted to meet me, fully, who had no pretences. He wasn't putting on an air, and at the same time, he's enormously powerful. He later told me that he realised that he was much more powerful than he realised, if you see what I mean. He said to me that Pragnamata from Bombay, who used to run or part of the Theosophical Society, where Bhante used to go and give talks, and she told Bhante that at that time, which was the late 50s, early 60s, that Bhante was demonic. I think she meant daimonic, if you see what I mean, just sort of full of an energy that was transpersonal. And Bhante said that he realised that to him this was just normal, and that he didn't always appreciate that we lot couldn't match that energy. And I think some of the troubles came from that. I certainly couldn't. And he just sort of overwhelmed me. But extremely kind, never unkind. But I think difficult if you've got that degree of energy and that degree of sort of understanding, always to appreciate what it's like for other people. And again, I remember talking to him about somebody who'd been very close to him, and then they moved apart. And I was saying, it's very difficult for him. He'd been, I think the expression I use, flying on borrowed wings. He was sort of soaring higher than he could. And then when he's away from Bhante, he feels himself to be sort of dropped from a great height. So I remember Bhante looking sort of puzzled and slightly pained. He said, well, I suppose I'm with myself all the time, so I don't know what I'm like. So there's a sort of touching naivety to him, which sort of redeems even some of the blindness, the blind spots. Yes, so that's the sort of energy that I remember when I think of Bhante, this quite young man, actually. He's probably 44 or something like that when I first came in contact with him. I was 20. And enormous energy and this sort of sense of extreme ease. He's not very socially adept. The wonderful thing, taking Bhante to see my parents. And he were a little bit proper. And it completely confounded them. They didn't know what to do with him. Even my New Zealand mum. They just didn't know what to do with him. He just sort of didn't really quite, it didn't fit. At the same time, it didn't bother him. So that sense of extraordinary energy, extraordinary insight, understanding, brilliant mind, dangerous, so a live wire, well, more than a live wire, more like an atom bomb.
So when you say dangerous, because I'm sort of...
oh, okay.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, I suppose...
That sounds automatically sort of negative, but obviously you're not meaning that.
No, not
so
at
what
all.
is it?
Well, I suppose that, I remember Bhante talking about the wrathful figures that appear in the Bardo. You remember, and those of you who know the Book of the Dead. First of all, the peaceful deities appear, and then the wrathful deities appear. The Buddhas appear in wrathful form. So Bhante was saying, so they're not really wrathful, they're still Buddhas, so they're compassion incarnate. But because you're alienated from them, they appear to you as wrathful. So even compassion can appear threatening and dangerous. Compassion isn't just nicey-nicey. It can be, sort of dangerous.
So it's sort of disarming kind of, you can't pretend or hide.
Yeah. My slender, the patchwork of ego identity, which, the times were ones where young people, young men, in my own case, were not that secure. And but I don't, certainly didn't mean any harm at all, but he was threatening. He didn't sort of pander to my idea of myself. I'm really grateful that he didn't. I'm really grateful that he didn't. Yeah, because it was a pretty pathetic self at that stage. Yeah. So that's what I mean, and I think that's probably everybody experiences that to some extent, coming in contact with the Dhamma. There's something not very comfortable about it, and one may find ways of reacting against that, but at the same time there's something absolutely incontrovertible about it. So something of that with Bhante. He was his own argument, and at the same time not at all, for me, comfortable. Others got on really easily and well with him. It depended on character and temperament and so on. But yes, to begin with, I was terrified of him when it really comes down to it. I didn't think I was, but that's what it comes down to. But not that he was trying to frighten me. Yeah.
Thank you. I've been reading, I was telling you the other day, I've been reading Great Disciples of the Buddha. And reading about Shariputra and Moggallana and as being chief disciples of the Buddha, and sort of their beginning relationship with the Buddha and then how they evolved and developed, and it's very interesting. And then I thought of you as well in relation to you being one of Bante's chief disciples, follower of Bhante, sort of doing your best to exemplify some of his teachings, or at least sort of articulate and understand and represent some of his teachings and ideas in different ways. So I was wondering about you as a follower, and thinking what sort of, how do you think you have been as a follower, in terms of what qualities or attributes do you feel you've been able to really sort of bring out, and also where the areas you feel like you've could have done differently, let's say, as a follower.
I did license you to ask any questions. Well, I think that through no fault of my own, as it were, or no virtue of my own, I've got a brain that seems to seize the essence of the matter very quickly. I don't know why. It's not something I try to do. I just seem to see it. And I think I got Bhante very quickly. And I'm also quite, again, through no virtue of my own, it's not something I've struggled to do, it just, I got it, I don't know why. I seem to be able to articulate in a clear way. So I think I've been able to understand what Bhante's talking about very quickly, and I've been able to articulate it in a way that's digestible and approachable. I think I've also understood what Bhante's mission was. And for instance, with this place, certainly I'm by far definitely not the only person who formed this place, but I had a decisive influence on the shape that it took, and the shape that the institutions took, and the way we organised things through Bhante. So I think I've been quite important in articulating the vision of the movement that Bhante had, and helping to create the framework that we have, which is really so effective. And I honestly feel completely modest about that. I don't. It's sort of, one has talents and abilities which one can't really take, personal pride in. It's like, taking pride for the fact you've got 5 fingers or something like that, just the way it was. And yes, so I think I've been able to do that. I think I'm less gifted in as it were, in the psychic sphere, if you see what I mean. I've certainly done my faithful meditation, and I get my strength from my meditation practice. But I'm not a sort of natural meditator, and it's not where my seat is. No, that's not true. But it's, I have to do it. I have to decide to do it, whereas others are just do it. So I haven't been able to bring out that part of Bhante so much. And Bantu is an exceptionally broad man, and I think that it'll take us many, many years to unpack all the different aspects of Bhante. I mean, he did have a very acute psychic attunement. I've experienced that personally a number of times with things like deciding to phone Bhante, and he decided to phone me, and coming to decisions about things, and then finding he'd phone me and tell me, to do what I decided to do, that sort of thing, and a very strong psychic acuity that was very likely naturally held. So I don't think that side of Bhante I've been a vehicle for so much. I enjoy art and culture, but I don't think my sensibility is that fine. Bhante had a very, very fine sensibility, and way, way beyond my understanding. And so I think many of us have contributed to articulating Bhante, and each of us will do that through our own particular characters and our own particular ways. And I think that process will continue. So I don't think we've plumbed the depths of Sangharakshita. I think there's a lot more to come out of Bhante that future generations will draw out. There's a lot of secret teaching, if you like, things that are not necessarily part of our common culture at this point, but which will emerge later. He's an exceptionally broad man, and deep. Broad and deep. Unbelievable that I came in contact with a man like that. I don't know why we came in contact with a man like that, a giant, a genius by any stretch of the imagination. Awkward old fella, but yeah.
Thank you. So
let me say a little bit more about that, because there was a point where my confidence in Bhante failed.
Yeah.
I don't know whether, and I'm very ashamed of that. Well, I've got over it now, but I feel that I did let him down as a disciple at one point. I think I've made up for it since then, but I felt I had to.
You thought you had to make up for it?
Yeah. I think I made mistakes which affected the movement, because I was in a position of considerable responsibility, and I think I've made up for that. But basically, I was not able to reconcile Bhante's personality in some respects with my deep response at a spiritual level to him. And I had to go through a process of sort of sorting that out, which I think the whole movement has had to do, that we have to accept this is what happens, this is what he was like, these are maybe blind spots, whatever you want to call them, but there's something infinitely vaster than that. And it must be like that, which I found very useful reflecting on myself. I might try to say more about this rambling, but I think all of us have an issue with being a very particular shape and kind. And I'm a very particular shape and kind of a certain age, a certain culture and so forth and so on. And how does one relate that to the Dhamma? And how does one use that in the service of the Dhamma? That's been a big struggle all my life, really. Yeah, so I think that I had to come to terms with something about the nature of human personality and its relationship to what is ultimate in Bhante, that then I had to reflect back on myself. Yeah, which thank you, Bhante, for... He never, ever said anything to me.
During that period?
During that period. I said a lot about behind his back, sorry, Bhante, but I slagged him off rotten. But obviously it hurt him a lot. But he never, ever approached me. And when I just confessed to him, he said, "Oh, don't worry, it's all gone." Yeah.
What sort of helped you? Is there anything? Can you remember anything you did, or any that actually helped you get to that point where you was able to have those insights?
I couldn't get the damn man out of the way. He's too big. You know what I mean? You can't. You know what I mean? It's not easy to dismiss him on that level. But. So he's sort of his own argument. And I did 10 years ago, I did a long solitary retreat, sort of towards the end of digesting all this. It was very, very painful. I was 8 months alone. And I thought, I must crack this. Because I realised that without Bhante, I'm nothing. I'm absolutely nothing. I mean, of course, I'm without Bhante now, but I'm not. At that time, I was sort of denying that within me. And first of all, I read right the way through the memoirs. I think I read them in about 10 days. I just solid right the way through. Yeah. So inspired. I think Bhante communicated so much of the Dhamma through his memoirs that it doesn't come through in other ways, indeed. But the other thing I did, you can tell what sort of person I am, but I set myself to do the prostrations every day. And that man was sitting there at the front of the refuge tree between me and the Buddha. And, sometimes I'd have to sort of force myself to go down. And then suddenly it dawned on me that I wasn't going for refuge to Bhante. I was going for refuge to the Buddha. But Bhante was the vehicle through which, or the doorway through which I approached the Buddha. And then everything fell into place. I'm not going for refuge to Bhante. I'm not thinking he's perfect. It's okay. It would have been better if some things hadn't happened. But it's okay. And the Buddha is still there. I believe the Buddha was a Buddha. That is, he had perfected himself, and so that his manifestation in space and time was, to that extent, perfect. But I don't think that's true of Bhante. I think it's very, very hard to be perfect in that way, if you see what I mean. So I just came to terms with it in that way. And it's interesting, I knew that not just that from my side I was reconciled, from his side. Right. I felt it in the solitary, It's a great relief. The world suddenly comes back the right way up. But I'm so sorry that I caused him that pain. Because I was one of the leading disciples. It must have been very, very disappointing to him. But he never complained. I could see he was hurt.
Thank you. So I mean, it's maybe a similar question, but sort of from a different angle, I guess. Around, in a way, the more you're a follower, and also the way you've reflected on your relationship with Bhante, then that changes you. Sort of the insights you've had, and I'm just wondering about you as then a leader. You sort of acknowledge yourself as a leader, really, in the movement. So again, in terms of your own leadership and people following you, what do you feel what have been your sort of qualities, I guess, or areas you've had to be more aware of in relation to how others work with you?
Well, I think I'm a very good man in a crisis. Do you know what I mean? If you have a crisis, call for Subhuti, because when the going gets tough, I get very, very cool and resourceful. I don't know why, it just happens. I love a crisis. But I'm a restless soul, and I think that institutions don't need that. So I think at times I've been over, and my restlessness has affected things, if you see what I mean. So I think I have given leadership at times when it was really needed. I think I've had a boldness, which comes of just pig ignorance. You know, I'm too stupid to be frightened. Like, you know, Attila knew we couldn't do this job, but I didn't. I'm still there.
Of the building,
The
Creighton.
building. You knew we couldn't do it, didn't you? But yeah, just, I don't know, sort of background and so forth. I just had that sort of confidence that I could do anything. And it took me quite a long time to realise I couldn't do anything. So I think you benefited from, English military background, public school boy. Time to retire him. But you know what I mean? I had skills that were needed at the time, which helped create a breakthrough. I brought also blindnesses, narrownesses, misunderstandings, cultural predispositions, and so forth to it that caused their waves. Hopefully, by and large, flattened out on the beach, as it were. Yes, I'm not sure what more to say. I, in some ways, more recently, of course, people may know that I've retired from the Public Preceptors College. The official retirement age is 75, which I think is indecent. To me, it seems like, God bless the College of Cardinals, but it seems to me way too old for people in their 70s to be deciding on the future. It seems indecent. And also I felt that actually I wasn't needed. That if I can contribute, people still respect me and they know that I'm worth listening to and they can make up their own minds about it. But I felt it was important for me to step aside, that I should not be a leading figure in the same way, because I thought that my own character was not the one for the time. I felt that some time ago, that I was not the man for the moment. And I could, by that time, accept that in humility and equanimity. Yeah, because I think something that's been very strong for me is the idea that I want to live in service. I want to serve something bigger and put what I am at service, which means that I shouldn't be worried about what I do. Of course I am, but I shouldn't be doing it for me. And I've tried to live by that. So when I think I'm not the right man, I try to withdraw myself. I don't know what to do. I do want to do something, so I'm thinking of starting a centre in Prague. But
should we talk about that off camera?
I sort of feel I want to do something new, but. I sort of feel I've given what I could in a certain way, in a certain time, in a certain layer, and it's time for me to exit stage left and see what happens next. Yeah.
I mean, that's quite a skill or quality or a faith in order to do that, because in many situations people, even in this kind of context, people can get very identified with the role, and actually find it hard to let go, or they have to be sort of gently.
Don't worry, they've already started, Suryagupta.
Gently encouraged, let's say.
Yeah.
So the fact that you sort of really saw that, understood it, and stepped aside, before your
I think my
retirement
instinct
age.
has always been to be from the start preparing my successors. Just my instinct. Partly because I'm restless, so I don't want to be stuck with something, and partly because Bhante taught us that the aphorism of the moment was up and out, or what is it? Work to make yourself redundant. This was right when we were starting the job, before we came here. Work to make yourself redundant. So I took that to heart. Prakasha, I handed on to him, and it was very much as soon as I saw Prakasha and began to see what he was made of, I thought, oh, okay, here's my escape route.
So you were our second chair, Prakasha.
Yeah. Kula Mitra was here earlier. He was the third. Yeah. So I just came naturally to me. I think I've got a certain sort of worldly confidence that probably comes from having a New Zealand mother and a Captain RN as a father, if you see what I mean, and going to an English public school.
So you mentioned there about service as a sort of key aspect of what motivates you. And we had a bit of a conversation on the phone around dharmic leadership, sort of what that might look like, that might be different to leading in other sort of contexts. So I just wondered if you'd had any more thoughts on that that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah. Well, I began to think about this, particularly trying to identify what bodhicitta means. Presumably most people are familiar with the term. It's generally translated as the will to enlightenment. It's not really quite right, although will is quite good because it does have a volitional dynamic dimension to it. But either way I interpret it is a mind that is soaked in ultimate reality. And which you come into relationship with, as it were, within yourself. Of course, it's not really within yourself. And so reflecting on that, which I find extremely inspiring. I remember hearing this series on the Bodhisattva ideal. I've been so inspired. And I went on the seminar, Dave Mitra was there, on the Bodhicharya Avatar. And, I wanted to be a Bodhisattva. And so the conclusion I came to is that actually this notion of bodhisattva is very, very exalted, but is also quite experienceable, if you see what I mean. And I particularly identify it with what happens to you when you take responsibility. This is the context we were speaking of. That when you take on a responsibility, such as the chair of a centre like this, or a public preceptor, private preceptor, something happens to you that is not you. And you described it as two minds, two selves, or two minds, I think you said. And I identify this very much with a reflection on some level of the bodhicitta, so that the mind that you sort of take on, or that takes you on, is not really interested in you in a way, which is, of course, the roller coaster ride that you have to get accustomed to. It's a mind that just sees that responsibility in the largest possible context, and that is the medium through which you serve. Not quite well put, but something of that order. I remember it very, very clearly when I was in India, and I'd helped to form, Lokamitra started, but I took on from him with Subhadra the men's ordination process. And after some time I moved on from that, and Subhadra took it on completely. Then his health collapsed, and he had to withdraw. And so I remember sort of thinking, I wonder who's going to have to take over again, or going to have to take over now. And I suddenly realised there's nobody ready yet. The Indians were not ready. And I realised it's only me. And I did not want to do it. I don't want to go back to do something that I've already done. But the sense was, there's no question, absolutely no question, I have to do it. And, once you actually embrace that, it's great. But there's a sort of hiatus. There's a moment when you don't want to, you resist it because you've got some inkling of what it means. And then you sort of, some higher sense in one realises that actually it needs to be done. And then when you give, I was going to say give into that, just like that.
Well, it's a surrendering.
It's surrendering,
isn't it, of sorts,
you find that you've got the resources and you've got the will, you've got the enthusiasm, and you can do it. So I think there's something about leadership and the Dharmic connection that's quite different from other connections. And no doubt there's parallels elsewhere, but I think we need to develop a bit more of a sort of understanding of that. and how to handle it, because, as I'm sure you're finding, that it's a pretty wild ride, and you need to look after yourself. But when you're being driven by this larger sense, even this larger consciousness, how do you reconcile it with your own needs? And you have to somehow find a way to for that dimension to see this dimension and its needs. Yeah. Much more to say. But yeah. But it's extraordinary at times, that sense that you're just responding. Bhante writes about it, doesn't he? On the 6th of December 1956 in Nagpur, he writes about functioning, what does he say, as an impersonal force. Yeah.
And after the death of Ambedkar.
Yeah.
So sort of curious. We talked about your general aspects you've been developing as a leader and a follower. What is actually your practice? What do you do on a sort of?
I do the Manjushri Stuti Sadhana. So I pretty well every day visualise Manjushri, and I do it very sloppily and badly and all that, but I derive enormous inspiration from it, and it sustains me. Just recently I've been, not quite the right metaphor, but toying with the Avalokiteshvara sadhana, in which you visualise yourself as Avalokiteshvara. And I've done that a few times, and very much connecting with this sense of a larger consciousness. And even though I decided I sort of can't quite stop doing the Manjushri Stuti Sadhana, it's too deeply ingrained in me, I've sort of brought something more of that, the flavour of Avalokiteshvara into that. I've never been particularly attracted to Avalokiteshvara prior to that. But it sort of seems to be informing my practice of the Manjushri Stuti Sadhana, and a very strong sense I want to give myself up to that larger consciousness, and particularly at this stage of my life, I'm 71 in 3 weeks' time, and it's clearly not the time to take on a major project, apart from starting a centre in Prague, but or maybe in Ireland, I'm not sure, but another centre. Or something completely different, I don't know. Nigeria, I thought about that, because I went to Nigeria when I was in Nigeria for 5 years when I was 10. But where is he?
There he is.
Yeah, we're going, aren't we? With Jana. Jana's coming with us. It's not really the time to take on anything that's too physically demanding. But I'm a bit lost what to do, to be frank. I feel I need to withdraw from more of the things that I'm doing. Not yet the LBC presidency, I promise. I'll wait until I get the signs from you. Exit, fire exit, do you think? Or no flowers at the end of talks. No chocolates, that's the main thing. But I'm in a new phase of my life. I probably reached old age rather late in life. Doesn't one always? But it's sort of coming to terms with the fact that I am actually old, and I'm really enjoying being old on the whole. But I'm not quite sure what to do with it, because I seem to have tons of energy. So I don't quite know what to do with it. And but I know that I can't do what I once would have done, which would be to take on a project, bully people into following me, and lead them over a cliff. I've been over that cliff. A damn good cliff. Look, you're all living on that cliff. It's not the time for that. So I'm sort of a bit bewildered as to how to function, and sort of feeling that I cannot decide. I've got to make wait for something to decide itself.
Right.
And maybe nothing will decide itself, and it's just a question of sort of waiting. But it's a bit uncomfortable for one of my temperament, because I'm a get-on-with-it chap. As I was famously called in the early days, the leader of the shut-up-and-get-on-with-it brigade.
So basically you're describing finding yourself in quite new territory.
Yeah.
So how are you practicing with that? What's that?
Oh, you beast. I suppose the main thing is trying to restrain myself from finding something to do.
Right.
And it's sort of trying to stay loose. So next year, for instance, I'm going to do a 6-month solitary retreat. And I'm going to shut the doors for 6 months. And I won't go to India in the monsoon as I usually do. And, well, I don't know what I'll do. But I'm hoping that, I'll adjust in some way, and either something in particular will become clear, or I'll be more comfortable with remaining in a gap. I already feel that in some ways I'm able to be a bit more useful because I'm not so involved.
Right.
If you see what I mean. And one of my main sort of mental mantras all the time is just stop. Just stop. Which is, it's a bit like, stopping a train which has been running down a hill with putting the brakes on and bang. But that's what my main practice in a way is just stopping and trying to sit in reality. And sounds good, doesn't it? But it's not so easy. Not so easy. And I've got an active brain, and I've got an eye for what needs to be done. And I obviously think I'm far cleverer than everybody else, and I see things nobody else sees. So, etc., etc. But I'm having to sort of restrain myself.
I mean, I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's another, in terms of, it's being a practitioner, isn't it, and being a disciple of the Buddha, actually, that you can stop, and work with what that then brings up for you.
Yeah. Well, I always think of the Buddha and Angulimala. Do you remember? Angulimala's trying to catch up with the Buddha, and the Buddha is just staying ahead of him. So he says, stop, O Shramana. And the Buddha turns and says, I have stopped. Have you? And so I'm trying to do that.
You mentioned doing the 6 months solitary. You're going to be doing that at your home.
I am, yeah.
And you've been living in Wales with Srimala, who's my public preceptor.
Sort of with Srimala.
Sort of with Srimala. Just wonder if you want to say anything about your context and what's been really fruitful for you. I mean, obviously every living situation has its advantages and disadvantages, but what's been fruitful for you living out in Wales with Srimala?
Well, as you know, your public preceptor is a very particular person, extremely retiring, but very, very deep, and very, very still. So I've gained a huge amount from just being around her, and she gets completely fed up with me, racing around. And not another lecture, shut up. No, you know now what to say. Living around her has been very beneficial, and we have separate quarters, which is, suits us both very well. And we live sort of separately but together. I'm away a lot, which is, means she gets a lot of time on her own, sometimes too much. But when I'm there, I do try to stop. And unfortunately, the modern technology means you can never be alone with an internet. And I have to make very strong decisions not to do that. And again, Srimana's complete technophobe. And not only that, she breaks technology. It just stops working and she goes anywhere near it. I think she's got some sort of force field that destroys technology. I find that really useful, actually. Sometimes a bit expensive, but it's just somebody of completely opposite temperament to mine. In all sorts of terms, in Myers-Briggs or whatever, she's complete opposite to me. So it's been very interesting and useful. And I spend a lot of time in India, and I have what is very necessary to me, a lot of contact with other men. I do live in men's situations a lot of my time, but I'm delighted to be with her and very much respect her and value her and annoy her and irritate her and all that sort of thing. She never irritates me, of course. And she's funny, she's fun, she's playful. We do a lot of work together on the place.
It's very remote, isn't it?
It's
That's
very
the thing.
remote, yeah. It's 5 miles from the nearest town, and our nearest neighbours are more than a quarter of a mile away, half a mile away, and you hardly ever see anybody. And it's Wales, so lots of sheep and lots of rain and lots of wind, but very, very beautiful and open, expansive. I love it. I was brought up in the country, so never completely adapted to city life. But yes, I think we're probably going to have to leave there. Age does wither them. And, I caught myself on a roof the other day with a hammer in my hand, realising that my balance wasn't quite as good as it used to be. I don't think I ought to be up here. I can probably do it for a year or two. But so we're thinking of moving on, maybe to Prague. I just visited Prague. I loved it, and it needs a centre. So it's not a. Many will know that I preach strongly against the sin of going off to live with your girlfriend, and like many of the words that I've had to eat that one. It's not so bad. It isn't the complete end of the spiritual life. Of course, there are issues to deal with. Attachment is one, and main one perhaps. But I think we're both old enough to have got a little bit beyond all that. All that, can I leave it at that? We still have a bit of fun though, I'm sure.
I didn't ask you anything about that.
I wish I had your complexion at this point.
It's all going so well. So, moving on. You mentioned, well, in a way, what's going on for you is kind of the letting go and stepping back from responsibility.
Yeah.
At the same time, you said that you're seeing, all the potential and opportunities still there. You're still involved in Hungary.
Yeah.
And India.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you had any sort of aspirations, wishes for those particular contexts.
Yeah. Well, for India, what I wish for is happening, which is that Indians are taking on the leadership. They've taken it on. Because I've retired from the college, I'm not in the cooler of public preceptors, and Karen Amaya has just recently retired. So it's entirely an Indian public preceptors cooler. And, I feel certain pride that I've contributed to that happening, not me alone. But they're as good as any of our leading order members. And they have their own particular flavour that I think is very, very valuable. This extraordinary capacity for faith and uncynical. don't have a cynical bone in their bodies, and but very wise, very astute, very, very careful in their dealings with people, and I realise that actually they're far better qualified than me to work in that situation. Again, I'm conscious that, perforce I was one of those in a leading position in India, and I'll never understand India. It's a very different culture in many ways. I understand a certain amount, but there's a lot I don't understand. They certainly find me a bit of a puzzle, but it has to pass on to Indians, and I'm delighted that that has happened. And so, for instance, next year I won't go out in the monsoon, whereas usually I'd go out twice a year, because I know it'll be all right. And I got their permission because I wanted them to, own that I wasn't coming. And they would, no, it's fine, come out next time. But they say, what we do want from you is more Dhamma teaching. But, we don't really need you for these big decisions or whatever. Sometimes I can clarify principles for them. But, I'm very, very confident about the future of the order in India. And the women's wing of the order has started more slowly for cultural reasons and accidents of history. And it's, to that extent, somewhat behind. But it's coming up very fast. Okay, and we all agreed we had a public preceptors Kula meeting in Rajasthana with Karanamaya, where she decided to step back. She's now got a very serious illness. Right. And so she thought it was best to step back now before that strikes. And we all agreed we would work with the leading women to get them to be public preceptors as soon as we can. And I can see it'll happen. So it's very satisfying, very gratifying. It's independent of me, it's free of me, I can still make some contribution. And, I've got so many dear friends there. To begin with, I just couldn't relate to Indians beyond a certain point. They don't have psychological problems, for a start, which what you talk about. Of course they do, but it's a very different sort of structure, not so complex. But now my soul is partly Indian. I can relate to Indians very, very readily. So I want to keep up that connection, and I will as long as I can. Yeah.
You've talked in the past about, with me anyway, sort of working with your conditioning in a way, going to India, going to Hungary. That's sort of what you've had to do. Acknowledge your conditioning in terms of being, public school, English educated, and then how that then impacts on your relationship. So that's been something you've gained from.
Yes, and it is interesting. I've come from a very, very privileged background. I've suffered almost nothing in material or social sense. All doors have opened to me, and I've honestly believed that every door, I was entitled to walk through any door I wanted to. It never occurred to me that I wouldn't be welcomed or whatever. And I think it was difficult for me to understand that wasn't the case for a lot of people. I thought they just needed to snap out of it and get on with it. If I say this, don't get me wrong, it's sort of an honest mistake. Do you know what I mean? From the perspective I was looking at, it seemed like that. So circumstances have sort of thrust upon me working with people from some of the most backward and underprivileged situations in the world. And, having to empathise with them, perhaps easier than empathising with people from different backgrounds in England, if you see what I mean. It's easier for me to empathise with people from a completely different background. But that's enabled me to have a wider empathy. I found working with my friends, brothers and sisters in India, very great privilege, and seeing the way in which they faced with such courage overwhelming and horrific prejudice. And I know people face prejudice of a very unpleasant kind here, but it's got an extra edge for it because it's so institutionalised. And again, just horrific in Hungary, because of the. It's so like India in some ways, the segregation of gypsies, Roma. The gypsies I'm in contact with call themselves gypsies. They don't like to call themselves Roma because that denotes those who speak Romani. So I'm using a term that is generally in the West considered politically incorrect, but that's the term they choose. So just seeing people who come from the most appalling deprivation and where the majority population is so rabidly and openly hostile to them.
Yeah, there's a lot of discrimination. I mean, I personally really appreciate the fact that you're doing that work and you've made those connections in Hungary and in India with, obviously continuing Bante's work in India. But, with crossing cultures, crossing continents, crossing very different set of conditions. I think that's important for them. It's also important for us because, we are in a world which is suffering and we sort of, as Buddhists, need to know how the different ways to reach that. So I appreciate you sort of kept that real connection alive, and you're obviously still thinking of that. I want to circle right back now because we're coming to the end to the LBC.
I'm getting excited. Lots of
I know. I can see you ready to. But we've got your rambles coming. Okay. So just in terms of being
Shut up. This is a masterclass in how to handle a president.
So do come to the rambles. So yes, we have launched our 40th. We're looking ahead to the next 40 years. I just wondered, what wishes, aspirations do you have for us at the centre?
In a way, it's so simple, isn't it? Just carry on, just reach out to more and more people. What I do think about London is that, particularly this time, and who knows what's going to happen after March next year, I think we have a unique opportunity that London is a multicultural city in a way that probably few are and have been in the world. And I think it gives us an amazing opportunity. And what I'd really like to see is the LBC consciously cultivating the spreading of the Dhamma in other countries through those that you have coming here. For instance, you had a chap here, Mitra, who's from China, and he's going back to China. Maybe he's gone, I'm not sure. But I talk with him about what he's going to do when he goes back. How is he going to take it forward? And I think others have done so too. So I think that you've got an opportunity for the spread of the Dhamma at this place where I think we've got a brilliant transcendence of particularity of culture. No doubt we could do it much more. And I think we could use that to reach all the way around the world. You probably have every nation in the world in London at the moment, and many of those people will come to the centre. From those cultures will come to the centre, and let's make sure they go back with a sort of package and a backing that can spread the Dhamma, because it's needed everywhere. And I think we have in Triratna, and the London Buddhist Centre it sort of exemplifies Triratna, I think, to a very full degree, perhaps in a way more than most. Well, certainly more than most, perhaps even arguably, because I'm loyal to the LBC more than any. It exemplifies the full range. And so I think you have a sort of special opportunity and responsibility for seeding that all over the world. And I'd like to see some sort of conscious attention brought to this, since you've asked me. I'd also like to see us reaching much more actively throughout London. London is famously a series of villages, and each of those has its own unique sort of culture. And I, you know, my father was a naval officer, so I'd like to see a big map on the wall with pins on it, and you know, troops being moved into. I'm sure you can understand how I'm thinking. Well, joking apart, I think some sort of kind of strategic view is not a bad thing.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, you know, one wants to accept people who come as individuals. But those individuals have, you know, they bring something particular. Just as I've talked about, I brought something which, you know, just genetically, as it were, just accident of culture and so forth, which does its bad bits and its good bits, and I put that at the service of the Dhamma. So everybody walking through the door brings something which is accidental to them, to some extent, which can be put at the service of the Dhamma. And part of that will be a passport of another country, and
a connection
with another country, or a language that comes from another country, or just not coming from this cultural background, etc., etc. And so I think we need to sort of become more adept at using our particularities and helping to take this precious gift of the Dhamma, which I guess I feel, probably like every old person, that the world is more dangerous than it's ever been, although in some ways it's better than it's ever been. But the forces of instability are more threatening than they've ever been. They're because of the increase in destructive power of technology. And I think there's an urgent need, and there's an extraordinary opportunity. So I think the London Buddhist Centre should play a very major part in that. London Buddhist Centre, for instance, was the base from which Manjuvajra, Punya, and Vajradhaka went to America.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm sure others have gone elsewhere.
We've had lots of pioneers in all different ways.
Where? Paris.
Yes. There's been I think Spain. I mean, there's Parami there, so Spain.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, because I think that's a very specific, concrete thing that we can be thinking about, and also what I want to say to you is what you communicate to me over the time that we've been in communication is your love for this centre, and you know, your dedication to it, and as I said before, your loyalty to it, and to what it's doing in the world, which is sharing the Dharma and sort of, you know, doing its best, alleviating the suffering that's on our doorstep and across London. So I want to thank you for that, Subhuti. And I would encourage you to come to the rambles, because I think you were saying to me earlier that you know, that many, you know, he has all these ideas, lots of ideas, don't you, that they're there and they're waiting for the opportunity to sort of for you to sort of express them, and you don't always know what's going to emerge, and that sort of makes it a very sort of live, exciting, sort of dangerous sometimes. You never know what Subhuti is going to come out with, as I discovered this evening. We're always engaging. So do come to that. And I just want to, on behalf of the centre, present, but also the future, you know, want to thank you for all that you've given to creating this Sangha for us, and a context for us to practice. And we've got something for you.
Oh, wow. They still want it.
I just want to add that you do all this as dana, don't you? We don't he's president to the centre, then come down, and we don't give you anything particularly. We basically have a bowl at the end, and people give donations, and that's how you do your work. So if you're feeling want to continue to support Subhuti in the work that he does, and also the thinking that he does. He's going to at some point take a break and just stop, which is good in lots of ways as a practitioner. But out of that, we know there'll be fruits that we'll benefit from. So if you do want to feel moved to support you, please do. There'll be a bowl outside, and we'll also have that through the week in the rambles. But I want to thank you for coming this evening and being a really sort of engaging. I've enjoyed it. Have you?
Yeah. I knew I would.
And I hope to see you tomorrow. There'll be Sangha Day where we've got, it's a full day tomorrow. Subandhu Mati and Maitri Bandhu leading that 21 Mitra ceremonies in the evening. And a whole day of puja and talks. Looking back 40 years, we'll have some of our senior disciples of Bhante, senior practitioners of this centre speaking, but also very new people as well. So Parama, you're giving one of those talks, aren't you? So please do come tomorrow, and I hope to see you the rest of this week. So thank you. Yeah, thank you.
We had fun.
Yeah.